This summer we visited the friendly and beautiful country of Portugal. Portugal is a European nation located on the Iberian Peninsula, bounded on two sides by the Atlantic Ocean and on the other two sides by Spain. Our visit was by way of our old friend Viking River cruises and started with 5 days in the capital, Lisbon. From there we went north 150 miles by bus to the city of Porto and the Duro River. Here we boarded a Viking ship and cruised on the Duro River for 1 week. Portugal was early populated by seafaring people like the Phoenicians and Carthaginians. The Romans ruled Portugal for nearly 600 years, bringing Roman buildings and engineering, Christianity, and the Portuguese language, which derived from Latin. Later, the Moors conquered and ruled most of the country for about 500 years. Modern Portugal dates from the 13th century, but mostly we think of Portugal for its exploits during the Age of Discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries. Through naval exploration and discovery, Portugal became a world power with an extensive colonial empire. Prince Henry the Navigator developed new methods for ocean navigation, and a new type of ship, the caravel, which could sail almost directly into the wind. In 1487, Bartholomew Diaz became the first ship captain to reach the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. Portugal was searching for an ocean route to India and the spice trade. Vasco da Gama sailed for India and arrived at Calcutta on 20 May 1498, then returning in glory to Portugal the next year. Today, Vasco da Gama's tomb is prominently displayed at the Hieronymus Monastery in Lisbon. In the spring of 1500, Pedro Cabral set sail with 13 ships, and upon landing on the coast of Brazil, claimed this new land for Portugal. However, the real goal of the expedition was to open a new trade route to India. Accordingly, Cabral proceeded around the Cape of Good Hope and landed on the east coast of Africa in what later became the Portuguese colony of Mozambique. Then he sailed on and landed in Calcutta, India in September 1500. Ferdinand Magellan was a Portuguese sea captain who sailed for Spain in the first expedition to sail around the world. Magellan died in the Philippines during the voyage, but one ship, the Victoria, completed the journey in 3 years. At its peak around 1580, the small country of Portugal controlled a vast, far-flung empire extending from South America to Africa. Various colonies in the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia, as well as Macau and China. Former Portuguese territories are now part of 53 different sovereign states, with Portuguese as the primary language of 250 million people. The Tower of Belém was constructed in 1522 by King Manuel I. Originally built in the middle of the Tagus River, it served as a fortress to guard Lisbon harbor. It became the starting point for the early explorers as they departed for far-off lands. The tower and the nearby monument to the discoveries are now major tourist attractions. The Monastery of Hieronymus, a giant white limestone church and monastery that stretches for 300 yards along the Lisbon waterfront, was built by Manuel I as a thank you for the return of Vasco da Gama and the riches he discovered. The vaulting in the church is held aloft by slender octagonal columns, creating a feeling of space and harmony. In 1755, the city of Lisbon suffered a devastating earthquake, fire, and tsunami. This, along with wars with Spain and Holland, contributed to the decline of the Portuguese Empire. The Marquis de Pombal, chief minister to King Jose I, immediately took charge and began the reconstruction of the city. Pombal is honored today by a giant monument in the center of the city. Allegorical images depicting the earthquake and Pombal's political, educational, and agricultural reforms decorate the base of the monument. When Pombal rebuilt Lisbon, he envisioned a city like Paris with a grand tree-lined boulevard similar to Champs-Élysées. So today we have Avenida de Liberdade with monuments and squares and patterned ceramic tile sidewalks. Our hotel was located along this street. Here we have a monument to honor the veterans who died in World War I. Many old buildings have iron balconies. The obelisk at Restoration Square honors those who fought the War of Restoration in 1640. There are many excellent seafood restaurants along this square. Next, we have Rocio Square with a statue of Dom Pedro IV. The jacunda trees from Brazil were in full bloom while we were there in May. A pigeon-lined statue of King João I, King of Portugal around 1400, and father of Henry the Navigator. We are looking down Rua Augusta toward Lisbon's own Arc de Triomphe. Now we will use the Gloria lift, a yellow funicular, to climb a steep hill to the upper town called Bairro Alto. Here we are rewarded with a nice view of the city, and in particular a view of St. George's Castle, originally built by the Moors. We are confronted with some very narrow streets in Bairro Alto. The Church of São Roque was founded by the Jesuits at the end of the 16th century. Inside is a beautiful chapel designed and assembled by architects in Rome, then transported to Lisbon by 3 ships. We are now in the Chiado district, an area that has long been popular with writers and intellectuals. Camões is considered to be Portugal's greatest poet and is buried in Hieronymus Monastery alongside Vasco da Gama. Fernando Pessoa is Portugal's most famous 20th century poet. The elevator de Santa Justa, designed by a Portuguese engineer who studied under Gustav Eiffel, will carry us back down to the lower town. Our tour guide explains that Portugal is famous for its use of painted ceramic tiles to cover everything. Here we see building exterior walls covered by tiles. A well-known restaurant uses painted tiles to create scenes on the interior walls. A railway station in Porto uses blue tiles to create scenes from the history of Portugal. We visited the National Tile Museum and learned that ceramic tile artistry came from the Moors. By the 18th century, Portugal was the leading producer of painted ceramic tiles. The blue and white tiles of the Baroque period are considered to be the finest ever produced. Our tour group had a chance to paint our own tiles that were later returned to us glazed and fired. Like American blues music, fado is an expression of longing and sorrow. The people of Lisbon have nurtured this poignant music in backstreet cafes and restaurants for over 150 years, and it has altered little in that time. A cultural icon for the Portuguese, Amália Rodrigues was the leading exponent of fado for over 50 years. She crystallized the music style in the post-war years and made it known around the world. Marisa, who comes from Mozambique, is currently one of the most popular fado stars. She sings the song that we are listening to now.
Se desejar fosse ser, é uma simples melodia das que se aprendem a viver, mas é tão consoladora a vaga e triste canção, mas já não chora.
This neighborhood was not rebuilt after the earthquake in 1755. And retains its tangled medieval street plan. For the Moors, the Kasbah-like layout was perfect for frustrating invaders. Compact houses lined steep and narrow twisting streets, with drying laundry often strung between houses. Small stores and restaurants seem to survive in this urban jungle.
Mas é tão consoladora a vaga e triste canção que a minha alma já não chora, nem eu tenho coração, sou uma emoção estrangeira.
The Portuguese are mad about soccer. Cristiano Ronaldo is probably the most worshipped person in the country. Ronaldo is considered one of the best players in the world. Portugal has its own professional soccer league, the Premier League, with two of the dominant teams in Lisbon. SL Benfica plays at the Stadium of Light, and Sporting CP plays at Estádio de José Alvalade. This monument in Camacha notes that football was first played in Portugal in 1875. Portugal hosted the 2004 European Football Championship. The final match of this year's championship was played in Lisbon while we were in Portugal. The winning team, Madrid Real, stayed in our hotel. While driving around Portugal, one becomes aware of major new infrastructure projects everywhere. New highway, new bridges, new airports. The government financed this new construction with loans from the European Union, mainly France and Germany. Following the worldwide debt crisis in 2008, lenders suddenly became aware that Portugal might have a problem repaying these loans, and interest rates went up dramatically. Portugal now has an economic crisis resulting in cutbacks and unemployment. Located just north of Lisbon, the Queluz Palace was originally built in 1747 as a summer palace for the royal family. After a 1794 fire destroyed the Palace of Ajuda in Lisbon, Queluz became the royal residence and venue for official receptions. It was the last of Europe's great Rococo palaces. Dom Pedro of Braganza, the builder of Queluz, and Queen Regent Maria I. Maria went mad after Pedro's death and was eventually bundled off to Brazil. The ballroom featured a gilded Rococo design among the finest in Europe. The music room with Maria's picture above the harpsichord was the setting of many large concerts for which the palace was famous. The chapel featured a domed ceiling. The baby cradle in this bedroom offers a bit of nostalgia. This room features ceramic tile panels illustrating the wealth of Portugal's colonies. The king's bedroom, also known as the Don Quixote room, has glass-mirrored columns supporting a coffered ceiling. The room is encircled by figures of Don Quixote. Maria's children are painted frolicking in the garden. The French-designed royal gardens were among the finest in Europe. We now move on to the mountain village of Sintra, about 15 miles northwest of Lisbon. Due to its cooler climate, Sintra became a summertime retreat for royalty and other wealthy residents of Lisbon. Despite all the tourists, the village still has an artsy-craftsy air about it. Here we have the royal palace built by the Portuguese kings in the 15th and 16th centuries. The Pina Palace sits on a mountaintop high above Sintra. This fairy tale castle was built by a German-born Prince Ferdinand, a contemporary and cousin of Bavaria's Mad King Ludwig. Here we have downtown Sintra with a lady selling handmade dolls and Sylvia shopping for a cork handbag. I gave this guy some money. It is a rainy afternoon, but we proceed on out to Cabo de Roca, a sheer cliff 140 meters high with a lighthouse at the peak. This is the most westerly point of continental Europe, where the earth stops and the sea starts, wrote the Portuguese poet Louis Camões. Here is the Cape on a better day. We proceed on down the Portuguese coast back toward Lisbon. This coast along the Atlantic Ocean is very similar to the California coast.
Deus, ela enxugou meu pranto, foi assim que aconteceu. Deus, ela conseguiu me destruir em segundo. Deus, ela fez de mim o menor homem do mundo. Deus, com uma frase, ela me jogou no chão.
We are now entering the coastal city of Cascais, formerly a fishing village, but now an important resort and tourist area. An old fortress that once guarded the entrance to Lisbon harbor is now a summer retreat for the President of Portugal.
Mas essa situação está virando uma tortura. Deus não deixa eu cometer uma loucura. Tira essa mulher de mim, de dentro da minha cabeça. Apague do meu pensamento, faça que eu esqueça. Tira essa mulher de mim, me tire dessa situação.
Another old fortress guarding the approach to Lisbon. This is now the Tagus River estuary. The 25th of April Bridge crosses the Tagus River. It is often compared to the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. We now must say goodbye to Lisbon and board buses to travel 150 miles north to Porto and the Duro River. Along the way, we stopped for lunch and a fado performance in Coimbra, Portugal's third largest city. As we arrive at the restaurant, waitresses welcome us with their college cakes. We also pay a brief visit to Portugal's oldest and most renowned university, the University of Coimbra. The impressive library contains one of the most complete collections of scholarly works found anywhere in Europe. As the bus crawls down the hill toward the Douro River, we catch our first glimpse of Porto. Porto is a very old city and was undamaged in the 1755 earthquake. Thus, its street layout and some buildings date back to medieval times. Porto is Portugal's second largest city, with a metropolitan area population of 1.7 million. It was always an important trading center at the mouth of the Douro River, and then in the 1700s became involved with aging and marketing of port wine from grapes grown in the Douro Valley. This monstrous iron bridge, Louis I Bridge, is one of 6 bridges crossing the Douro River in Porto. At one time in the past, barrels of wine were hauled down the Douro River on flat-bottom boats called rebellos. They made a hair-raising trip through the rapids that populated the river back then. Upon boarding the Viking ship, everyone learned how to wear a life jacket. We start our tour of Porto by crossing the Louis I Bridge, and then we look back across the river at the Porto suburb called Gaia. Here you find the warehouses where port wine is being aged and sampled by the tourists. This monument stands in the waterfront district called Ribeira. Our tour group walks through an ultra-modern shopping mall in downtown Porto. This coffee shop has delicious pastries. An unmistakable landmark is the Clérigos Tower. At 75 meters and sitting on a hilltop, this tower is visible throughout the city. This cathedral was originally built as a fortress church in the 12th and 13th centuries. It stands on a hilltop overlooking much of the city. The statue of Vimera Perez, who recaptured Porto from the Moors in 868 AD, guards the entrance to the cathedral. You will shortly hear the ringing of the church bells. We will now enter the cathedral through these doors to view the interior. Our tour guide explains the history of the cathedral and how the plaza we are now standing on in front of the building overlooks the city of Porto. The other buildings adjacent to the cathedral are the bishop's residence. The building facing us with a ceramic tile facade is the Porto train station. Inside the waiting room of São Bento train station is a feast of azulejos, or ceramic tiles, depicting early modes of transport, rural festivities, and historic scenes. The train boarding area is clean and bright. Liberty Square and the Avenue of the Allies were so named following Portugal's participation on the Allied side in World War I. Sylvia just had to stop by McDonald's in downtown Porto. Port wine is made by adding brandy to partially fermented wine, thus stopping the fermenting process and increasing the alcohol content to about 20%. This mixture is aged in oak barrels for a period of years, then bottled and sold, or aged for an additional period of time. Port comes only from a demarcated region of the upper Douro Valley, stretching about 100 kilometers east from Rigora to the Spanish border. There are many different companies making and selling port wine under numerous labels. The majority of this wine is still consumed in the British Isles, and British companies still control most of the trade in port. Two people are noteworthy in the history of the Douro Valley. The first is an Englishman named Joseph James Forrester, nephew of a wealthy wine merchant who came to the valley very young and fell in love with the place. He produced the first accurate map of the Duro River and did much to promote the valley. He eventually died in a boating accident on the river. The other person was a courageous and determined woman named Dona Antonia Ferreira, the daughter of a rich landowner and wine merchant. During a period when vine diseases were devastating the farmers in the valley, she purchased properties and made investments, and worked feverishly to control the diseases. The Calum Winery provided a guided tour of their wine warehouse in Gaia, where they had thousands of gallons of port wine aging in oak barrels. Sylvia and I sampled 3 of the Calum wines and found them very tasty. On the afternoon of our second day in Porto, our Viking ship, the Torgal, begins cruising up the Duro River towards Baitos. The Torgal is custom built to sail on the Douro. It can fit into the locks and travel under the low bridges. The Duro River rises in the mountains of northeastern Spain and flows in a westerly direction for 360 miles. Then for the next 70 miles, it forms the international border with Portugal. And finally, it cuts across Portugal for 130 miles to reach the Atlantic Ocean at Porto. The section in Portugal has been made navigable through a series of dams and locks. The scenery along the Douro is spectacular. Deep gorges alternate with tranquil valleys and rocky hillsides laboriously sculpted into terraces planted with vines. Tiny villages dot the riverbanks where women gather to wash clothes in the river. Then there are other areas so remote that you see no sign of human habitation.
Cala, parece esquecer. Ah, mas se ela adivinhasse, se pudesse ouvir o olhar. Mas se ela adivinhasse, se pudesse ouvir o olhar.
This night we are served up something special, a delicious traditional dinner in the breathtaking surroundings of the Alpendurada Monastery. Founded and built by Benedictine monks in the 12th century, the monastery is set high on the riverbank near the small Roman town of Baetos. Most monasteries in Portugal are owned by the government and have been turned into hotels, restaurants, or lodges to pay for their upkeep. The Roman and Moorish-influenced interiors boast beautiful religious icons and historic furnishings. We enjoy a glass of wine out on the terrace and feast our eyes on the magnificent views of the Duro River valley. Following dinner, traditional Portuguese fado singers entertain us with some of their old favorites. Then we head home. Early the next morning, our ship arrives at the Carapatello Dam with a lock system over 112 feet high. This is one of the highest in Europe. Here we are near the top of the lift. After the lift is completed, we look back at the top of the dam. This next stretch of the river contains some of the most breathtaking scenery along the entire journey.
Vestida de papel cedo minha madraça de mágoa para que nada suceda minha madraça de mágoa para que nada suceda.
The Viking Torgal arrives in the city of Rigua around 11 a.m. Rigua is the capital of the port wine region. There is time for a brief walk around Rigua. Here we see the fresh market where every type of fresh food is sold. Here is the main street of the old business district. Tales of miraculous cures turned Lamego into a place of pilgrimage and led to the building of the tiled Baroque church of Nossa Senhora dos Remedios on a hill southwest of the town. Finished in 1771, it stands at the top of an elaborate flight of granite steps which took over a century to build. Some climb up on their knees. The less devout walk up. Women wishing to become pregnant are particularly drawn to this shrine. Here we are in the town of Lamego, looking up the stairway to the church. We enter the church through these doors to view the interior. Here we see the altar covered with gold leaf. There is an abundance of statuary in and around the church. Now in downtown Lamego with a visit to the museum. A statue to a bishop from Lamego who became head of the Catholic Church for all of Portugal. The museum is justly proud of its collection of Flemish tapestries which date back to medieval times. They also feature a wide collection of religious figurines and an ancient bathtub. The cathedral at one end of town was constructed in the early 16th century. However, the square tower dates back to the 12th century. Here we are on the main street of Lamego, Avenida Alfredo de Souza, a monument to the soldiers who fought and died in World War I. Now we're at the other end of the main street looking up at the stairway and sanctuary of Nossa Senhora dos Remedios, a small chapel in the center of town. A group of elderly men walking and talking together, a widely practiced custom throughout the country. From Lamego, we travel a narrow twisting road up a mountainside to the winery known as Quinto de Seixo, owned by the Sandeman Company. Sandeman's famous trademark is the Don, a Spanish caballero of Jerez dressed in a black wide-brimmed hat and black cape. Our tour guide follows through with that theme. Once on top of the mountain, we have a spectacular view of the Douro Valley. Centuries of toil have created stone terraces planted with grapevines on virtually every hillside. The wineries, called quintas, cling to the steep slopes, and roads that seemingly only a donkey could navigate twist and turn between the fields. We tour the winery, then go outside for a close-up look at the grapevines. Notice that the posts holding up the vine trellises are long pieces of cut stone. Nearly all the grape harvesting in Portugal is still done manually or womanly. Some of the wineries still stomp the grapes in the same old way with bare feet. At the end of our tour, we sample a couple of the delicious Sandeman wines. We then travel down to the picturesque town of Pinhal, the epicenter of the Douro wine industry. These old concrete structures were once used to store wine. The evening entertainment is provided by an enthusiastic musical group, Alto da Escrita, playing and singing Portuguese folk music. After leaving Pinhao, the ship travels through a gorge with some jaw-dropping scenery. Before the dams, this section of the Douro was filled with rapids, making navigation extremely hazardous. The Englishman Baron Forster drowned here in 1862 when his boat was swamped and he was pulled to the bottom by a money belt filled with gold. We next encounter the Valeria Dam and Lock with a lift of 100 feet. As the ship approaches the border with Spain, the landscape becomes drier and more barren, although there are still patches of green. This region is famous for growing olives and almonds. Finally, we dock at Barca de Alva on the Spanish border. Here we travel south by bus to the ancient medieval hill town of Castelo Rodrigo, a town that has been preserved as a historical site and tourist attraction. It has only 50 inhabitants today, with jumbled narrow streets and no prearranged grid. Being on the border with Spain, it had a history of wars and destruction. We enter the town through the old main gate and trudge up Main Street to the top of the hill. Our guide pointed out a house inhabited by New Christians, a term given to Jews who converted to Christianity to escape the retribution of the Inquisition. It has 3 crosses above the door. The town has a little old church dating back to the 13th century. They have a small restaurant and store where I purchased a nice wool sweater for Sylvia, who had been freezing in the cool Portuguese weather. From the castle walls, we get a broad view of the countryside below. Here we see the current populated town of Figueira de Castelo Rodrigo. On the way back to the ship, we pass through a national park where we spot a pair of Egyptian vultures nesting among the rocks in the valley below us. Along the way, we see many little white structures and are told that they were built to house pigeons raised for fertilizer and meat. Here is a better image of one such house that I found on the internet. To reach the Spanish city of Salamanca, we drive through 60 miles of relatively flat farming country. This is the breadbasket of Spain. There are a few small towns and villages, but mostly just farmland and grazing land, with stone walls everywhere. The walls are not high enough to retain livestock. Apparently, they only mark property lines. Sheep are quite common in this part of Spain. Once in Salamanca, we quickly find Plaza Mayor, the exceptional grand Baroque square at the center of the city. Salamanca is famous for its architecture. Stone carving in soft brown sandstone so beautiful and delicate that it would be almost impossible to duplicate in today's world. Here we have Salamanca City Hall at one side of the square. The square is host to a series of medallions bearing the busts of some of Spain's most important historical figures. Here is a bust of Cervantes, one of Spain's most important literary figures, well known for his classic masterpiece, Don Quixote. The square features many lovely shops and bustling cafes, among them a McDonald's. This statue has the mayor and his architect studying plans for the new square. The square is also host to a pair of nesting storks. Storks are highly revered in Spain. The spire of the new cathedral can be seen in the distance. Here are some street scenes near the square. During lunch, we watch flamenco. The original owner of this house of shells was a doctor at the court of Queen Isabella and a member of the Order of Santiago, whose symbol is the shell. It is now a public library. A charming, peaceful courtyard. One of the gargoyles in the courtyard. A beautifully carved stairway. We now visit the world-famous University of Salamanca that dates from the 13th century and is the oldest in Spain. As an educational institution, this college is considered on a par with Oxford, Bologna, or Paris. We are soon confronted by the courtyard of the schools and the main facade of the university. Among the embellishments on the facade is a famous frog sitting on a skull. It is said that if a student could locate this frog, he would have good luck. The statue in the courtyard presents a famous instructor from the late 16th century, Fray Louis de Leon. The university has preserved the original classroom from which the master taught, and the simple desks of the students. This building, where students once prepared for their university studies, contains one of the most beautiful courtyards in Salamanca. It now houses the University Museum. Salamanca has two cathedrals built tangent to each other, an old cathedral and a new one. Both are elaborate, and they were built when stone carving skills were at their highest peak. The older cathedral was built in the 12th and 13th centuries and showcases a variety of architectural styles from Gothic to Renaissance and even Byzantine. Its breathtaking 15th century altarpiece features 53 panels depicting scenes from the lives of Christ and Mary. Here we see the dome of the old cathedral, known as the Torre del Gallo. The new cathedral is much larger and features flying buttresses and an elaborate main facade with many intricate stone carvings. The Plaza de Anaya, and in the background the towers of La Claricia. The Puerto de Ramos, which faces the Plaza de Anaya, is another one of those sandstone masterpieces with hidden features. This time it's a small astronaut sneaked in during restoration work. As we cross the old Roman bridge to leave Salamanca, we look back at the great cathedral.
Oh, my love's broken. Oh, my darling, in my own sleep. Oh, my darling.
That night I go up on deck and find that I have it all to myself. The next morning our ship leaves the Spanish border and begins the trip back down the Duro River towards Porto. Some of this country is quite wild and barren. In other places, olive trees and almond trees populate the hillsides along with vineyards. Please enjoy the scenery as we sail along the Douro.
Nas voltas do Rio Douro há uma graça tamanha que diz logo ter nascido nas lindas terras de Espanha. Noinairoso violento, lembra cruzeis em tropel, numa desfilada ao vento, ao Douro no redondel. Ó meu Rio Douro, do vinho famoso, ó Rio dourado, não sejas vaidoso. Ó meu Rio Douro, do vinho famoso, ó Rio dourado, não sejas vaidoso. Até ao mar, onde margens dão um mote a quem o queira sonhar, imitando Dom Quixote. Rio Douro tem dois nomes, não era o Douro que tem, é um rio para dois que se dão bem. Ó meu Rio Douro, do vinho famoso, ó Rio dourado, não sejas vaidoso. Ó meu
The ship approaches the Galera Dam and Lock. This time we will be lowered about 100 feet to the river below. We arrive in Pinhao shortly before noon and immediately board buses to travel a narrow winding road for about 10 miles north to the Avasada Winery. Here we are met by our genial host, the winery owner, for a brief tour of the winery and a delicious lunch. This winery is part of a cooperative of wineries that produce and market a delicious sweet wine, Moscatel, under the brand name Fabios. Fabios is the name of the local village. Following lunch, we traveled to the village of Fabios for a tour of the modern wine production facilities owned by the cooperative. We also visit their storage and aging facility. Then, of course, we also sampled wine. Next we see a small bakery which produces and markets a hard-crusted bread, favored by some of the locals. Our visit to the bakery calls for a celebration.
100 outside to produce 1,000 a day. So the baker need to wake up at 6 a.m.
Finally, we tour the Favios Museum and learn something about the history of winemaking in the Pinhal Valley. Looking out the museum window, we can see local vineyards. On the trip back to the ship, the bus passes numerous cork trees by the roadside, which have been stripped of their bark. Cork is a major product of Portugal, and is a surprisingly durable and useful substance. We know that it's good for stopping wine bottles, but it's also floor tile, ladies' handbags, watch bands, and many other items. The tree bark regrows every 9 years. Arriving back in Pinhal and boarding the ship, we find that the chef has prepared a special dinner, leg of lamb. The next morning, our ship sails on to Rigua, and we travel north by motorcoach to Vila Real, where we visit the Matus Palace. The palace is famous worldwide because it is pictured on the label of every bottle of Matus wine. The Matus Palace takes its name from the civil parish in which it is located, as does the wine. There is no connection between the palace and the wine other than the use of the picture for marketing. The palace was built in 1745, probably by Niccolo Nasoni, for a wealthy Portuguese man whose descendants still live there today. This beautiful Baroque building is home to a marvelous collection of paintings, furniture, books, and fascinating family history, and giving a glimpse into the opulent lifestyle of the Portuguese aristocracy. The palace is surrounded by formal gardens, beautifully and lovingly maintained, and featuring a 30-meter-long cedar tunnel, a tunnel formed by old intertwining cedar trees. The detailing on the palace exterior is all carved stonework, done in the Baroque style of northern Portugal. The interior features a spectacular entrance hall, with its carved chestnut ceiling and 18th century furniture. The Four Seasons Room, which takes its name from the large 18th century paintings, and the Blue Room featuring delicate Chinese porcelain. Unfortunately, most interior photos were not allowed. The library contains valuable books dating back to the 16th century. The men's restroom features marble urinals. Unfortunately, our tour of Portugal will be ending, so our ship starts the final leg back to Porto, where we board a plane tomorrow morning. You are viewing a few scenes along the river as we near the city of Porto. Here are some of the wonderful British and Scottish people we had the pleasure of dining with during our voyage on the Duro River.